She didn't fall, but she was supposed to. The flight attendant's forearm shoved into her chest like a door bar, sharp and intentional, halting her mid-step in the first-class boarding lane at gate A9. "Ma'am," the woman sneered, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "This line's for real priority passengers, unless you think that little costume makes you one." The word costume cut through the terminal noise like a blade. Colonel Nadine Walker said nothing. Not yet. She steadied herself, heels firm on the floor, eyes locked on the younger woman's face. Behind them, business travelers in tailored suits and scarves fell silent. One man raised his phone, but kept it low, filming like a coward behind glass. Nadine didn't blink. The flight attendant leaned in, voice dipped just enough to seem civil to bystanders, but cruel enough for Nadine to catch it clear. "Real soldiers fly coach. You're not fooling anyone, sweetheart." There it was, the line. The one that always shows up when they don't expect someone like her to belong. She glanced down at her dress blues, polished medals, ribbons, oak leaves. Each one earned over 29 years of service. Afghanistan, Iraq, Liberia, places this woman had only seen on the news ticker. Still silent, Nadine stepped out of the line, not in retreat, in strategy. She walked slowly toward a bench near the emergency exit window, sat, opened the flap of her inner coat pocket, pulled out a secure device no civilian would recognize. Her thumbprint blinked green, her voice calm as a sleeping storm. "This is Colonel Nadine Walker. Initiate Tier 1. Authorization code incoming." She looked up at the departure board across the terminal. "Let's see what they do when their system stops recognizing them. Tell us where you're watching from. What would you do if you saw this happen in front of you? Because one call's been made, and nothing about this flight is going where it was supposed to." Colonel Nadine Walker didn't need the uniform to remind her who she was. But this morning, she wore it anyway. Not for show, not for status, but because it still meant something. She'd earned every thread. 25 years in the Army, 15 of those in cyber operations, quiet work, invisible wars. She wasn't the kind of officer who showed up in press briefings or got surprise homecoming videos. Her battlefield was digital, and her victories were the ones that never made headlines because they prevented catastrophe in the first place, like the breach attempt at LAX in 2011. Nadine was the one who rewrote the firewall protocol at 2:14 a.m. from a bunker in Virginia while half the West Coast slept. That night, she stopped a hostile, foreign actor from hijacking the inbound flight routing system. 5 million passengers never knew how close they came to disaster. She'd written part of the backbone code that would later evolve into the CyberGrid Tier 1 platform. The very system now keeping 17 major airports in sync across the country. And yet, no medals for that, no parades, no names in marble. After retirement, Nadine settled quietly in Tacoma, the kind of neighborhood where people waved but never asked too many questions. She liked it that way. Raised a son, buried a husband, Marcus Walker, an Army medic who never came home from the Gulf. Wore her grief like her uniform, pressed, presentable, but never forgotten. And today, she had planned to do one thing: deliver a keynote at the Cyber Defense Infrastructure Summit in DC. A small hall, few cameras, just policy folks and military brass. She wasn't expecting applause, but she was expecting basic human respect. Instead, she got shoved at the gate by someone who didn't even bother to ask her name. That was the part that stuck. Not the shove, not the insult, the assumption that a black woman, standing tall in a military uniform, couldn't possibly belong where she was. They didn't know who they were looking at, but soon they would. Very soon. The silence that followed the shove was louder than the insult itself. Nadine stood there, shoulders squared, breath slow and steady. The boarding area had gone unnaturally still. No one moved. No one helped. To her left, a man in a gray suit lowered his newspaper slightly, then raised it again as if nothing had happened. To her right, A middle-aged woman in pearls clutched her tote tighter and turned her back. A few rows behind, a young man in a fleece vest was recording discreetly with his phone. But when Nadine glanced at him, he looked away. Not a single person stepped forward. And that, Nadine thought, was the real damage. She'd been in hostile zones, flanked by armed civilians. She'd stood on tarmacs in foreign countries, the only woman in a circle of generals. But somehow, this silent rejection in her own country, from her own people, cut deeper. Across the terminal, a black TSA officer briefly met her eyes. He didn't say a word, just nodded, slow, deliberate, a nod of knowing. But even he stayed where he was. Farther down the line, a young boy, maybe 9, tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something. The woman turned, looked at Nadine, then pulled her son away, muttering, "Don't stare." Nadine watched them disappear around the corner. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time she'd been treated like she didn't belong. But somehow, the older she got, the quieter the disrespect became. Less yelling, more dismissal, fewer fists, more whispers. And the worst of all, the silence of bystanders. She returned to her seat, not because she was done, but because she was calculating, waiting. The system she'd once built was still running across this very airport, humming in the background. Quiet, efficient, like her. But there was one feature they never thought she'd use, one tool built for emergencies. And today, Nadine realized, this counted. Because silence, too, could be violent. And the system needed a reminder of who had written its rules and who could break them. From her seat near the emergency exit window, Colonel Nadine Walker tapped twice on the screen of her secure device. A green interface blinked to life, minimal. No logo, no help button, just one phrase pulsing across the top. Tier 1 system, clearance level, auth prime. She hadn't used it in years. Tier 1 wasn't just an emergency coordination platform. It was the backbone of the real-time airport display network. The quiet engine that connected gate data, flight IDs, air traffic sync, and rapid incident escalation. She hadn't just helped design it. She'd authored 2 core subroutines still in use. The program still recognized her voice. Run blackout audit protocol. Scope. Airport gate sync visibility. AUTH code Sierra 9 Whiskey Delta 73. A brief pause, then command received. Audit initializing. Across the terminal, nothing happened. No alarms, no flashing screens. Just a subtle flicker on the gate board. Then, a small sync error blinked beneath 4 flight numbers. Barely noticeable to the untrained eye. But to the right eyes, it was the signal. Back at the Cyber Defense Summit in DC, 3 analysts would already be seeing the alert. Their dashboard was linked to hers. And in that moment, Colonel Nadine Walker wasn't a woman pushed in a boarding line. She was the highest priority node in a federal incident command chain. As she sat silently, the attendant who had shoved her walked by again, not even glancing down. Still in control, she thought. Nadine's lips barely moved. You just flagged your airline for an integrity breach, and you don't even know it. She glanced at her watch. In less than 90 minutes, a closed-door session in Washington would be called. Her name would be at the top of the report, not as a victim, but as the original architect, and now the activator. And when the final authentication hit, 17 airports wouldn't just blink, they'd go dark. The ripple started in Atlanta. At 10:14 a.m., an air traffic coordinator noticed a mismatch between the flight departure board and the FAA routing system. Gate B12 showed one flight as boarding, while the FAA had it listed as delayed due to network sync. Minor discrepancy, at first. Then it spread. Within 6 minutes, Chicago Midway, Denver International, and JFK all flagged low-level visibility inconsistencies across gates A through D. The screens weren't wrong exactly. They were out of step. That had never happened before. The Tier 1 display grid had one job: real-time accuracy across every linked terminal. And now it was jittering like a bad signal. By 10:26 a.m., two network engineers at the FAA Tech Center in Reston froze mid-coffee when an internal server flagged Blackout Audit Protocol, Active, Auth, COL, Walker. They stared at each other. "That can't be real," one whispered. But it was. And that meant one thing. A Tier 1 emergency ethics audit had been triggered manually, and only 5 people in the country had the authority to do that. Colonel Nadine Walker was one of them. Over in D.C., alerts began hitting inboxes at the Department of Transportation. The Secretary's Chief of Staff didn't wait. She picked up the phone and dialed direct. "Sir, we have a live audit flag on Tier 1, ethics level. It's not a drill. And you'll want to see the name on the trigger." Back in the Seattle airport, Nadine sat calm, one leg crossed over the other. No one around her had any idea. Flight attendants were still making their rounds, calling boarding groups, smiling like the skies were friendly. But the system beneath their feet was no longer theirs. "I built it to protect this country," Nadine whispered to herself. "But today, it's going to protect my dignity." And outside, on the far end of the runway, the first outbound flight received a clearance hold. 1 down, 16 to go. By 10:31 a.m. Eastern Time, every FAA Regional Command Center had received the same silent alert. Tier 1 sync audit triggered. Category: Ethics. Origin: Seagate A9. No red lights, no loud alarms. But every clearance officer who saw it sat up straighter. At the Pentagon, a quiet side channel buzzed awake. The Office of Strategic Cybersecurity opened a Tier 2 escalation thread. One name at the top of the chain made them pause. Walker, N. Full authority. Veteran clearance. Active. Within 2 minutes, the Department of Homeland Security, DOET, and FAA Ethics Compliance received internal pings. Not from a person, from the system itself. This wasn't a threat. It was a mirror, and it was forcing them to look. Meanwhile, at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, life continued as usual. On the surface, gate agents kept smiling. The flight attendant who shoved Nadine had no clue what was unfolding 3 layers beneath her clipboard. She was back at the boarding counter now, leaning in to whisper to a colleague. "She's still here, just sitting like she owns the place." Her coworker laughed. "Bet she called her grandkids or something." They had no idea. Back in D.C., a closed-door huddle had already begun inside the FAA's ethics war room. One official looked up from the dashboard and said, "Wait, is this the Nadine Walker? As in, the Walker algorithm?" Another nodded grimly. "She didn't just write part of Tier 1. She's the reason Tier 1 exists." That was when it clicked. This wasn't someone trying to bring down the system. This was the system calling out its own failure. And in that moment, they knew something big was coming. Because when a woman like Nadine Walker stays silent long enough, the first time she speaks again, it's not with a voice. It's with a signal that shuts down everything. Gate A9 was still boarding Group 4 when the first operational freeze hit. It started with a boarding pass that wouldn't scan. Then another, and another. The gate agent tapped the screen, frowning. "We're showing a sync delay. Network hiccup, maybe." Behind her, the flight attendant who shoved Nadine was leaning against the jet bridge rail, sipping coffee with one arm crossed. She rolled her eyes. It's always tech when they can't admit it's user error. But the agent's face changed. Her screen wasn't just slow, it was freezing, line by line. Terminal sync error, boarding roster mismatch, ethics override signal pending. She blinked. "What the—" Inside the cabin, passengers were beginning to fidget. One man stood up. "Are we leaving or what?" Another murmured. "This airline's always a mess." But the pilot, mid-call with ground control, went pale as a different message came through his headset. "Tier 1 sync lock engaged. Hold position. Do not depart." He looked at his co-pilot. "We just got soft grounded." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means someone pulled the ethics trigger." Meanwhile, Nadine hadn't moved, still seated, still composed. She glanced once at the gate board, which now blinked suspended under multiple flights. Around her, the same people who ignored her earlier were starting to panic. But Nadine? She opened her small leather case and took out a pen, not to write, but to sign. Because a secure email had just popped up on her private device from the Department of Defense. They'd seen the signal. They'd confirmed the breach. And now, they were invoking her emergency override clause, one she had quietly written into the charter 10 years ago. With a flick of her wrist, she signed the form digitally. "This isn't revenge," she thought. "It's restoration." And with that, click. 17 airports officially went dark. By 11:02 a.m. Eastern, 17 airports, from Seattle to Miami, were fully unsynced. Gate displays froze. Flight tracking systems misaligned. Digital boarding was suspended. Aviation forums lit up. Mass tech failure? Tier 1 is down. Did someone breach the FAA? But inside the FAA, they knew better. This wasn't a glitch. This was an intentional audit, a direct consequence of years of unchecked behavior now brought to light in the most public way possible. Back in Seattle, Nadine was still seated, eyes calm as chaos buzzed around her. Gate agents were scrambling. A supervisor arrived, red-faced and confused. "Ma'am, we're temporarily pausing all boardings. It's a national sync error." A passenger near Nadine scoffed. "Figures. They can't even run a boarding screen." But an older black man 3 rows away looked at her. Not just looked, but saw her. Recognition. Respect. He gave a small nod. He knew. Inside a secure Zoom room in D.C., an emergency session had been convened. Chairs from the DOT, FAA, DOD, and DHS sat in silence as Nadine Walker's name and photo flashed across the screen. One advisor leaned forward. "We're not dealing with a rogue actor. We're dealing with someone we decorated for integrity, and now she's holding up a mirror." Another added, "And let's be real, this isn't just about a shove. It's about a system that's failed to protect its own, especially women of color, especially veterans." An uncomfortable silence followed. Then the ethics officer finally spoke. "Begin the transparency pull. Every discriminatory incident tied to airline behavior in the last 5 years, expose it." A junior staffer whispered, "Sir, that's over 32,000 records." He didn't blink. "Start with Seattle. Start with Gate A9. And just like that, the audit went public. Barbara Reynolds, the flight attendant who had shoved Nadine earlier, finally noticed something was off. Her comms tablet wouldn't connect. Her ID badge scanner at the jet bridge flashed, "Access suspended." She scowled and tapped again. "Must be a tech issue." But then the airport loudspeaker crackled. Not the usual boarding call. "All ground personnel, please pause operations at gates A1 through A12. FAA ethics audit protocol is now in effect." Barbara froze. "Ethics audit?" She turned to her supervisor, who had just arrived, face pale as paper. "Barbara, we need to talk. Now. Why? What's going on?" But before she got her answer, a second announcement echoed across the terminal. "Federal ethics oversight has initiated a full review. Immediate suspension of involved crew until further notice." Passengers stared. One woman whispered, "Wait, is this about what happened to that soldier lady?" A young man pulled out his phone. "Yo, I saw someone shove her earlier. I filmed it. Want me to send it to someone?" Another voice, closer. "That was Barbara. She pushed her. I saw it." Barbara's heart pounded. "This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong." But someone had already pulled up the footage. It wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no fight. Just 1 second. A shove, a fall, and Barbara walking off like it didn't matter. But now it mattered. And every screen in the terminal, once filled with departure times, suddenly faded into a blue overlay. In white text, Gate A9, incident logged in review, Tier 1 Audit Protocol. Subject, Colonel Nadine Walker, returning in status, federal oversight active. Barbara backed away from the gate counter, and from the far row of seats, Nadine finally stood up. She didn't speak. She didn't point. But her presence now commanded the whole room. For the first time, the system didn't look past her. It looked right at her and listened. By 12:03 p.m. Eastern, every major news network had picked up the story. CNN was first to break the headline. Federal audit shuts down 17 airports after soldier pushed by airline staff. The footage of the incident had already gone viral, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, cold, calculated. A uniformed black woman, steady on her feet. A flight attendant, eyes dismissive. A shove. No apology. Just silence. But now, the silence was broken. Inside the Seattle Airport's secure operations room, a federal ethics officer clicked through the final reports. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke into the press feed now streaming live across terminals. Today's Tier 1 ethics blackout was triggered by Colonel Nadine Walker, retired U.S. Army, under lawful emergency code. The system verified a confirmed violation of civil protocol, discrimination based on veteran and racial identity, and abuse of crew authority. Gasps rippled through Gate A9. A child whispered, "She's a colonel?" An older woman nearby muttered, "They shoved a veteran. My God." Back at the boarding counter, Barbara Reynolds stood between two federal agents, shaking her head like she still didn't believe it. "This can't be real. I didn't even touch her that hard." But the system had already spoken. Her badge had been revoked. Her employment status marked suspended pending full review. And most damning of all, her name was now listed on the Federal Aviation Ethics Violation Register, a list that hadn't seen a new entry in nearly 6 years. Barbara wasn't the only one. 3 supervisors at Seattle-Tacoma's regional airline partner were also suspended. 2 gate managers had their credentials frozen, and the parent company's stock had already dipped 7.4% by noon. And Nadine? She stood calmly near the far window, phone in hand, watching the military escort arrive at the terminal. Not for her, for the flight log. Because when she triggered the audit, she didn't just flag the gate. She flagged the airline's entire operational compliance database, and that meant a full ethics report, covering 5 years of internal violations, was now being subpoenaed. As the press swarmed the terminal, a young journalist called out, "Colonel Walker, do you want to say anything to the public?" She turned, finally, and offered the softest, most cutting reply. "I didn't need to be seen today. I just needed the system to see itself." Then she walked away, not out of pride, not in anger, but because her work was done. She didn't push. She didn't yell. She made a call, and the world answered. It was 3:47 p.m. when the Secretary of Transportation held a live press conference in Washington, D.C. Behind her stood representatives from the FAA, the Department of Defense, and the Office of Civil Liberties. And for the first time in over a decade, the federal podium wasn't used to dodge responsibility. It was used to deliver a public acknowledgement. This morning, Colonel Nadine Walker acted within her lawful authority as a Tier 1 ethics authorizer. Her action did not compromise national security. It revealed a national failure. A reporter interrupted. "So, is the government apologizing?" The secretary didn't flinch. "Yes, to Colonel Walker, to every service member who's ever been dismissed in uniform, to every black woman who's had to prove she belonged in a space she already earned." Across the country, screens lit up. Veterans groups reposted the video. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and in dozens of airports, passengers watched the headlines roll across monitors that had gone dark just hours before. Colonel Nadine Walker forces industry reckoning. FAA orders immediate reform. But the most powerful response wasn't public. It was personal. In a quiet room back in Seattle, Nadine sat alone, still in her civilian clothes, her duffel by her side. She had declined all interviews. She turned down every major network offer. All she answered was a single call from a young black woman who worked as a junior analyst at the DOT. "Ma'am," the voice trembled. "I just wanted to say, I work on the audit back end. I saw your name come through and thank you for standing when the rest of us couldn't." Nadine didn't say much, just smiled softly and replied, "I didn't stand alone. I stood because you built the floor." That call lasted 3 minutes, but it would shape that woman's career for the rest of her life. Later that evening, the FAA issued a new executive directive, the Veteran Dignity Act, effective immediately. It mandated mandatory ethics retraining for all commercial airline staff, real-time cabin incident logging with external oversight, and a permanent ethics audit committee co-chaired by veterans and civilians of color. The kicker? The committee would be led, in its first year, by the very person who brought the industry to its knees, Colonel Nadine Walker, return. And while Nadine never asked for recognition, the system she once helped build had finally done what it failed to do that morning. It said her name. It stood for her. And it changed because of her. 1 week later, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport looked ordinary again. Planes took off. Families rushed gates. Baristas misspelled names. But at Gate A9, a small brass plaque had been bolted to the wall. "This gate is dedicated to Colonel Nadine Walker for reminding us that dignity doesn't ask for clearance." It didn't say what happened. It didn't have to, because the world already knew. The Veteran Dignity Act passed through Congress in record time, 92-8 in the Senate, nearly unanimous in the House. The FAA launched a full ethics overhaul, and 17 airlines rewrote their internal policy manuals within days under the supervision of the new Ethics Committee. At its first convening, seated at the head of the table, was Nadine Walker. She didn't wear her uniform. She didn't need to. She wore what she had on that morning. Calm, command, conviction. But for Nadine, the win wasn't the law or the press coverage. It came on a quiet Friday afternoon when she received a handwritten note from someone she didn't expect. "Ma, I know I've been distant. I thought your military stuff didn't matter to people anymore. I saw the news. I saw you. I'm proud to be your daughter, Lila." That letter broke her, not because she was weak, but because the strongest people don't cry when they're hurt. They cry when they're finally seen. Later that week, Nadine visited a local high school where a civic leadership class had asked her to speak. She walked in without fanfare. No press, no entourage. A young black girl in the front row raised her hand and asked, "Ma'am, did it feel good to shut down all those airports?" The class chuckled nervously. Nadine smiled and replied, "No, it felt necessary. Power's not about pulling plugs. It's about plugging people back into a system that forgot them." The room went silent, and that was the moment the kids understood. They weren't meeting a woman who got lucky. They were meeting the standard. Back at the airport, travelers occasionally paused at the plaque at Gate A9. Most kept walking. Some stopped and searched her name, but every now and then, someone just stood quietly and nodded. They didn't need to know the details. They knew someone made a call, and that call made the system answer. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't demand noise. It doesn't seek revenge. It just waits for the moment the world remembers its place. And in that moment, because of one woman's silent signal, it did. Tell us where you're watching from. And more importantly, have you ever witnessed someone stand up without saying a word, yet change everything around them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Colonel Nadine Walker right to make that call? Do you believe quiet power speaks louder than outrage? Your voice matters, especially in stories like this. Let's talk about it right here in the Telltales community.